have lost everything they own in the world in a storm that was just days ago named Imelda and is now just a pounding and swirling rainstorm. And put it this way, this storm without a name currently has now dropped the fifth greatest rainfall of any storm in the history of the lower 48 states. Texans of a certain age who remember storm names like bad family members may be stunned to learn this is worse than Claudette in '79. And in places, this is way worse than Hurricane Harvey 2 years ago. Listen, please, to a pregnant mother of 5 kids who, as of today, is left with her husband and 5 children and nothing else.
I looked outside and our whole entire yard was just covered in water. There was no way out. And I opened the door and the water was to our door. During Harvey, it wasn't like that. We were able to get out. And this way, we weren't able to leave. We weren't able to get out.
Sadly, there are hundreds of Texans going through that same hurt tonight, and they will need our help. George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston got their September monthly average of rain in 90 minutes. Some rain gauges measured over 6 inches per hour. Some places received over 41 inches of rain. As you see there, the Coast Guard was forced to land on I-10, and in places, I-10 and the Gulf were one and the same. The number of swiftwater rescues is now approaching 2,000. So please be thinking of the folks in parts of Houston and Port Arthur and Beaumont where the suffering is great and the water will remain high for some time. That's our broadcast on this Thursday night. Thank you for being here with us. Good night from our NBC News headquarters here in New York.
Tonight on a special edition of All In.
Chris, what you are telling me is that this is tough.
Yes.
I acknowledge that.
2020 candidates converge on the nation's capital to take action on the climate crisis.
It's even worse than you think.
We need an intervention, and we need it now.
We should stop lying to the next generation.
Plus, Big Oil New, our report on how the fossil fuel industry knew what they were doing to the planet and spent decades misleading the world.
Scientific evidence remains inconclusive as to whether human activities affect the global climate.
And I interview the man who spent 30 years fighting for action, former Vice President Al Gore.
That kind of a dam is breaking and people are changing swiftly.
Special edition of All In Climate and Crisis starts right now.
Washington, D.C. I'm Chris Hayes. We are live here at MSNBC's Climate Change Presidential Forum from the campus of Georgetown University outside the McCourt School of Public Policy. We've been speaking to 2020 candidates all day about the single biggest threat facing this country and this world. And right now, I think it's fair to say that we're at an inflection point. Tomorrow, people around the world in hundreds of countries and cities and all over the place will participate in the global climate strike to protest the use of fossil fuels, a movement that has grown astonishingly rapidly. Then after that, the United Nations Climate Action Summit begins next week. And the politics of the nation have never been more focused on this issue in its history. This new political focus is partly being driven by just what we're seeing in front of our eyes. Here's just an example. This is an extreme weather event just today around Houston, that's today, that just snuck up on everyone. Images of flooded neighborhoods, cars driving on expressways underwater, the streets underneath water, insane. Meanwhile, the President of the United States is not just inactive on climate change, he's not just indifferent on climate change, he's working every possible angle to make it worse. Just yesterday, President Trump barred the state of California from being able to set its own stricter fuel efficiency standards. The stakes have never been higher. What you're seeing happen in real time is this issue take on a status and a life that is now making it a priority for all the Democrats running for president.
We need a durable solution. We need a solution that will endure. And if we accept the political system the one that McConnell has devised and the one that Trump has inherited, where you either get nothing done or you get something done, and then 2 years later the other side just rips it out, you can't solve climate change. Climate change is a matter for a generation, and we should stop lying to the next generation about what's required here.
We know that you love electric vehicles and you think it's awesome. If you are the president of the United States, will you lead by example and order an electric presidential vehicle?
Whoa! Wow!
Yes, I will, and I'll go even better. The entire White House motor pool will be electric. There's a proverb that says the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. We should have been doing this work 20 years ago, but the second best time is now.
I want to tell the American people, it's as bad as you fear. It's as bad as you fear. And we are going to get through this because we're American. And we are going to have a season of repair. And we are going to mobilize. And it's not during World War II. It wasn't Democrats versus Republicans, left versus right. We are all Americans. And we are going to mobilize.
What is your other conception of what executive powers are available to you if, in fact, Mitch McConnell says that John Delaney's bipartisanship is not working.
Not happening
not working for him.
So I would use every single executive authority I could possibly muster, including considering a national emergency, to get this done. You asked earlier how important I think this is. That's how important I think it is. I don't think you do that. Certain things you do by executive action your first date. Paris, methane, California, 200 other things. Most of them, by the way, are reversing things that Trump overturned.
Right.
I don't think you go right to national emergency, because if you do that, you're done with the Congress.
Anybody that says they know what the economy is going to look like in 10 years, they're lying, because it's just changing too quickly. But I would just say that it's got to be something over time. And we've got to build the green economy to where it pays, which I talk a lot about doubling union membership in the United States. I think these jobs have got to be good, solid, union, middle-class jobs, because they're not going to go from a good, solid union, middle-class job to a job that doesn't pay.
This is very connected to human beings and suffering and shaking up of their lives and destroying the quality of life and the homeland of a lot of people. So in my immigration plan a few months ago in April, I actually said that we should adopt a new category of refugee, a climate refugee. And then we mirrored that in our environmental or climate change action plan because I believe that the United States does have a role to play in making sure that we do our part in addition to combating the climate crisis, reversing the effects of climate change, taking people in who have been hurt and will be hurt by this.
We spoke to 7 candidates today. We're going to hear from another 5 tomorrow, including Mayor Pete Buttigieg and Senator Cory Booker. We invited every single Democratic candidate, in fact, all the candidates, but the only one of the Democratic candidates polling in the top 3 who took us up on the offer was Senator Bernie Sanders. Obviously, he, Vice President Joe Biden, Senator Elizabeth Warren recently participated in a different climate town hall, but today was a great opportunity to hear more from a leading Democratic contender. Describe to me when and how you came to realize the acuity, the seriousness, the urgency of this problem.
Sometimes as human beings, we have a hard time imagining the future. We kind of look at next year and the year after that is kind of like it was last year. But if the scientists are right, and I believe that they are, next year is not going to be like last year. And 5 years from now, it's not going to be like 5 years before. We are facing an unprecedented global crisis. It disturbs me very, very much that we have a president who believes that climate change is a hoax. And what disturbs me about it is that attitude on his part, on the part of the fossil fuel industry, not only threatens the well-being of our country, it threatens the well-being of the entire world. Unlike Trump, I do believe in science. And what I believe is if we do not act in an incredibly aggressive way in moving away from fossil fuels to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. And what makes this issue even harder and more complicated, it's not just an American issue, it is a global issue. We got to lead the world. But if we do not do that, the planet that you will be inheriting and your kids and your grandchildren will be inheriting will be increasingly uninhabitable and unhealthy. And we have a moral responsibility to make sure that that does not happen. And as president, this will be a major top priority for me. These type of extreme weather disturbances hitting us more and more frequently with greater intensity. Think about people all over the world driven from their homes because they can't grow crops anymore. They can't find drinking water. They're going to go elsewhere. And what the CIA and the Department of Defense tells us is this creates a major international national security issue when large numbers of people are migrating and fighting for land. So here is the point. It seems to me you can approach this problem in one of three ways. You could do what Trump does, which is basically irresponsible and pathetic, and that is I'm being kind to him. Or, Chris, you can do what some of my colleagues do and say, look, of course climate change is real, but let's not overdo it. You know, we have a limited amount of money to spend here, and we got to be modest, and we got to be realistic about it. And a lot of folks are saying that. Maybe, I don't know what to tell you. I happen to believe in what the scientists are telling us, and that means that if we're going to save the planet, we have to be extremely bold. At the end of the day, you have executives in the fossil fuel industry, in the oil companies, coal companies, gas companies. Their scientists know exactly what they're doing. In fact, as you know, there's strong evidence that ExxonMobil, their scientists were telling them for decades, that the product that they are producing is destroying the planet. So how do you deal with executives who are in companies making billions of dollars a year in profit, and the product that they are producing, happens to be destroying the planet? You got that? You got to deal with that. And we not only are going to have to tell them that they cannot destroy the planet for their short-term profits, politically, we're going to have to stand up to them. And essentially what my campaign is about, whether it's the fossil fuel industry or the healthcare industry, which made $100 billion in profits last year, or the private prison industry, which makes money by throwing Americans into jail, we have got to stand up to the greed and corruption. I know those are strong words, make some of you uncomfortable, all right? I don't know how much they teach about that here in Georgetown. What we have got to do, and as President of the United States, this is what I would do. I would make an appeal to the rest of the world and say, you know what? We are now spending as a planet over $1.5 trillion a year on weapons of destruction designed to kill each other. And maybe the horror of what climate change could do to countries all over the world might just, under strong American leadership, bring these countries together in a way that says, you know what, instead of spending $1.5 trillion on weapons of destruction, why don't we pool our resources and fight our common enemy, which is climate change?
There's a real devil's in the detail situation where you have, say, I think a $50 billion climate resiliency fund. There's a crash program to improve storage, right? All of these are enormous pools of money. And again, I think you could argue they're in scale to the problem. But you're talking about administering this at a level that hasn't been done since World War II. It would be an enormous change in the capacity of the government.
Chris, what you are telling me is that this is tough.
Yes.
I acknowledge that. Okay? But what is the alternative? All right? I'm told that it is expensive. And I'm told by Chris, correctly so, this is administratively very, very difficult. He's right. But you tell me what the alternative is. If we do not act boldly and aggressively, all right, not only are we fighting for your kids and your grandchildren to be living in a planet that is healthy and habitable, all right, but I should also tell you that this plan, Chris, in the middle of that transition, creates up to 20 million good-paying jobs. We could retrofit buildings to cut the utilization of energy by 50% or more. It takes a lot of workers to do that. If we are going to be aggressive in moving to sustainable energy, wind and solar, I want those panels and other technologies to be done here in the United States of America. Massive amounts of work that have to be done. If we're talking about the electrification of our transportation system, that means creating a new rail system in America. We are already way behind Europe and Japan in that regard. That takes an enormous amount of work building those locomotives and those trains, especially under Trump. He has used executive orders very frequently and very aggressively, and I certainly would do that in terms of climate change. I work with Alexandria Cortez-Ocasio in introducing legislation which would declare climate change a national emergency.
And you would do that unilaterally from the executive?
Well, I think it is a national emergency, and I would use all of the executive powers that we have.
There's a mention in the plan when you talk about sort of holding fossil fuel companies accountable. We know that there are both private plaintiffs and states that are suing in a model that's not dissimilar from the tobacco lawsuits, which of course created billions of dollars in funds in public health. Would you use the Department of Justice for litigation against fossil fuel companies?
Duh. Of course I would. What do you do to people who lied in a very bold-faced way, lied to the American people, lied to the media? How do you hold them accountable? How do you hold fossil fuel executives who knew that they were destroying the planet but kept on doing it? We will hold them accountable. What do you do if executives knew that the product they were producing was destroying the planet and they continue to do it? Do you think that that might be subject to criminal charges?
I don't know.
Oh!
I'm not running for president.
Well, I think it's something we should look at. The guys who work on oil rigs, people who work in coal mines, people who work in the fossil fuel industry, they are not my enemy, they are my friends. And we are not going to do what others have done and turn our backs on those people. And as you know, if you're familiar with the proposal that I've introduced, we have allocated tens of billions of dollars for what we call a just transition. And so what we're saying to those workers, look, we don't hold you responsible for causing climate change, all right? But we have got to move away from fossil fuel. And what we build into our proposal is 5 years. 5 years of full pay, of health care, of job training, of education.
Right now, obviously, the amount of refugees we take in is at historic lows in terms of the recent history. And there's a lot of things that can be done in the executive in terms of asylum categories. Would you favor expanding the asylum categories, which are enumerated, right, to include a category for people that are specifically climate, pushed out by climate?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely something that we have to look at, and I think I would be positively disposed to that. But it has to exist all over the world. What she raised is, it's not just people in Latin America who would gravitate to the United States.
Sure.
It is people all over the world. And, it means that we have to deal with the crises in these countries right now so that people can possibly stay there. And we have to welcome people all over the world. We're talking about God knows how many millions and millions and millions of people who are going to be dispossessed as a result of climate change. It's a huge issue.
Much more tonight on this special edition of All In. I'll talk to some of these Georgetown students about who impressed them today and who didn't, plus our own report on the cover-up in the fossil fuel industry. And we'll hear from Al Gore about his decades-long fight to move the needle on climate. All that is coming up when we come back. seen a string of lawsuits targeting the fossil fuel companies. Some of the plaintiffs making the argument that was so successful in suits against the tobacco industry. Basically, that the companies knew the threat posed by their products, but misled the public, and that there was no cause for alarm.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive. I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
4 years after tobacco executives went before Congress and claimed, absurdly, that their products were not addictive, the nation's largest tobacco companies agreed to pay hundreds of billions of dollars to help pay for the damage their products had caused. Now, a similar reckoning may be coming for the nation's fossil fuel companies. Believe it or not, the biggest oil company in the world was once a leader in climate research. In the 1970s and 1980s, Exxon had top scientists studying the possible effects of climate change. It even modeled its research division on Bell Labs.
The research into climate change was not something in some remote corner of Exxon. It went from Exxon scientists at the mid-level all the way up to Exxon's top management.
The company was aware of the scope of the problem it faced. One internal 1979 memo warned that present trends of fossil fuel combustion, with a coal emphasis, will lead to dramatic world climate changes within the next 75 years. And that CO2 buildup in the atmosphere is a worldwide problem. But then something shifted in the late 1980s when the public began taking climate change more seriously.
Some experts are saying now that the whole world is heating up because of a global greenhouse effect.
The problems unaddressed have the potential for turning the world into a form of chaos not greatly different from that produced by global war.
That's when Exxon's public posture changed.
Exxon started to recognize that the UN and others were going to come up with maybe a global policy to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions, and it was going to affect their bottom line. This wasn't a remote issue anymore. It was something that they needed to address now, and they chose to address it by playing up the uncertainty and using a narrative that went counter to science.
Exxon started spending tens of millions of dollars to manufacture doubt about climate change. The company financing advertisements designed to look like editorials and fringe research, all meant to question the growing scientific consensus.
Scientific evidence remains inconclusive as to whether human activities affect the global climate. Many scientists agree there's ample time to better understand climate systems and consider policy options. So there's simply no reason to take drastic action now.
Thanks in no small part to Exxon's efforts, U.S. lawmakers did not take serious action to fight climate change. And by the year 2010, nearly half of Americans believed the threat of global warming was exaggerated. Now, a string of lawsuits is seeking to hold Exxon and other companies responsible. Last year, crab fishermen on the West Coast sued, seeking compensation for damage to crab populations caused by warming oceans. More than a dozen cities and counties have filed lawsuits, seeking billions to offset the costs of mitigating climate change. And 3 states launched investigations into Exxon and other oil companies, with New York and Rhode Island filing suit last year. As the court battles have ramped up, a warming world has been left to wonder what might have been.
What if Exxon had continued down the path of accepting climate change, being a good faith actor in all of this, working with the government? Where would we be right now if the biggest oil company in the world, a leader in industry, had done that? And so that's the question, right? Where would we be right now?
Up next, my interview with the man who has been sounding an alarm for decades, former Vice President Al Gore, the evolution of the climate discussion, what's changed, and the crucial work to be done now.
Individuals can't do it on their own. I mean, that's not meaningless, but as important as it might be to change the light bulbs, it's way more important to change the policies and the laws.
How do these other OTC... No risk. Call or go online now and see how Sheiks deliver the ultimate deep sleep experience. Sleep cool, sleep dry, sleep comfortable. Sheiks.
Constipation can happen all around us. You just need to know where to look.
There's no doubt environmental changes are happening at a rapid rate, and they was forecasting a while ago 75 years. They better look more like at 7 years, 7 to 10 years, as far as different places being uninhabitable here up onto this planet. He talks about this in the Bible, that these will be the birth pains of all the sin and all the corruption that the Homo sapiens are creating up onto themselves and up onto this planet. It talks about these things. Jesus warned us of these events that was going to occur in catastrophic ways, in astronomical ways. And sure enough, in these last days that we're living in, now we're seeing the beginning effects, not the full effects, but the beginning effects of these type of atmospheric environmental changes.
This is what would happen in Florida. Around Shanghai, home to 40 million people. The area around Calcutta, 60 million. Here's Manhattan. The World Trade Center Memorial would be underwater. Think of the impact of a couple 100,000 refugees, and then imagine 100 million.
It has been 13 years since the groundbreaking film called An Inconvenient Truth first hit theaters. It starred former Vice President of the United States Al Gore, who in the years since has not stopped fighting for action on climate change. I sat down for an exclusive interview this week with Al Gore in his office in Nashville, Tennessee. One thing I keep sort of focusing on is that there's this gap growing. I mean, the public opinion is moving quite swiftly right now.
Yeah.
In a way, I mean, just as an empirical matter,
Yeah.
you're getting 70, 80% numbers, right?
Yeah.
It's moving.
60% of Republicans.
60% of Republicans.
Yeah.
It's moving up the priority list of Democratic voters, right? So they're not only do you see more and more.
One of the other network polls in the summer said it was the number one issue among registered Democrats.
So that's happening at the sort of from the perspective of mass opinion.
Yeah.
You're also seeing all this organizing happening.
Yeah.
But you have a U.S. administration and a president who's, it's not just that he's doing nothing, who is, in this almost kind of sociopathic way, seemingly bent on making the problem worse in every possible way.
Yeah, it has a strange aspect to it, because he will say, for example, I want crystal clean water, even as he's stripping the protections for clean water, and there's just like an overload of outrage. I mean, when a new one comes along every few hours now, I have to download some existing outrage to make room for the new outrage, and in a way you wonder if that's not a strategy, actually.
The Democratic primary has been very focused on climate.
Yeah.
What do you think about the Green New Deal as a kind of organizing concept, set of principles for the debate that has been taking place within the Democratic primary?
I like it a lot, and I'm very mindful of the persistent sniping at it and the criticism of it. I like how it links environmental justice and the fight against inequality, and emphasizes the jobs that are really and truly there. I mean, solar installer is the fastest growing job in the U.S. for the last 5 years. Has grown 6 times faster than average job growth. Second fastest growing job is wind turbine technician. We could retrofit buildings in every community. It also reminds me, I'm a good deal older than you, but it reminds me of something called the nuclear freeze. Back in the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan had come in discussing the evil empire and building, restarting the arms race, people began to get really worried, and there was an emergent grassroots movement called the nuclear freeze. And just as has been the case with the Green New Deal, the expert community started sniping at it. Where are all the details? This doesn't make sense. But it was simple and clear, easy to grasp, and overwhelming majorities of the American people said, yeah, I'm for a nuclear freeze. And it played a role, a non-trivial role, in helping to change the policy context in which Ronald Reagan changed and became a devotee of nuclear arms control and reached historic agreements with his counterpart in the Soviet Union. So I'm really kind of thinking of the Green New Deal in a similar way. It has majority support in the polls, and people criticize it now. There wasn't Fox News back then, and you have this persistent drumbeat. But I do think that it's a very positive development.
You obviously had a very long career in public life, and when you were a senator and a presidential candidate, and even when you joined the ticket as your vice president, you were a member of the DLC. You were viewed as a kind of centrist part of the party, that Democratic Party that some within the party felt had moved too far to the left, that had hurt them politically, that there was also a need there was a kind of ideological rot, right? A sort of more friendly approach towards markets. I'm curious how you think of yourself ideologically, and if thinking as you have for 30 years about the climate issue has changed the way you think more broadly, ideologically, about the role of the state and the role of markets.
Well, a very thoughtful question. But before I get to the part about how my involvement with climate has affected this, I'll tell you this. Even though, along with Bill Clinton, I was identified with the DLC, Democratic Leadership Council, and the impulse to say, hey, look, if Democrats are going to win elections, we're really going to have to emphasize a pragmatic approach here. And as vice president, I ran the Reinventing Government project to cut waste and regulations that were unnecessary, but in the process, make government work better for the people. I was troubled that the net result of many trends, I thought our policies were very good, but the rise of economic inequality led me to frame my campaign for president in the year 2000 as a champion of the people, not the powerful. And I was harshly criticized by my former companions in the DLC for going a little bit more to the left of center. But I really genuinely thought that it was time to take account of the rise in inequality and the rise in a sense of powerlessness on the part of so many working people. Now, to the point of your question, there's no doubt that when you get deeply immersed in trying to help solve the climate crisis, you do come to understand the absolute necessity of a strong national government role in changing policies, because individuals can't do it on their own. That's not meaningless, but as important as it might be to change the light bulbs, is way more important to change the policies and the laws. And that requires a strong policy leadership role in Washington, D.C., especially from the president, but also in the Congress.
Still ahead, much more of my exclusive interview with Al Gore, including what he thinks about some of the people we just heard from in the forum today. Is there someone in the Democratic field that you feel best gets this problem, centers this problem, that you're the most confident? I'm not asking for an endorsement.
Oh, it sounded like that.
I'm asking.
You're just asking me to pick one and avoid the word endorsement if I wish.
Yes, it's the...
If people would had listened to Al Gore 30 years ago, I truly believe that we would not be facing the world crisisness of global warming the way that we're facing it right now, towards seeing all these radical changes. I mean, I worked with a guy down in Florida that was old school thinking, and I couldn't begin to count towards how many conversations that we had about this very subject, environmental changes. And for some strange reason, he would always go to the opposite end of the perspective, and he would try to justify his reasoning by saying, well, there was this amount of ice that was recreated over here versus the amount that disappeared over here. And to some degree, some of that in which what he was talking about almost made sense. But whenever you get to looking at how much, the mass amounts of ice that are melting versus the amounts that are not, that are basically being placed back onto the poles, it's not even comparison in regard to percentages of how much is being taken from versus how much is being given back. And it's really disheartening to know that that was basically, in 1989 was basically the time whenever this country could have excelled from a spiritual movement of the Jimmy Swaggart era that the Assembly of God Association was a part of, that they could have excelled tremendously if people would had done the right thing. And whenever I say people, I'm just not talking about people. I'm talking about leaderships of government, leaderships of federal as well as state government, if they would have done the right thing. All this was a tipping point to not only America but throughout the planet of whether or not we was going to excel and go forward or go backwards. And of course, me being the age that I am at 58, now I can look back. They always talk about hindsight. I can look back and honestly say, yep, that was where they went wrong. Was in the late 80s. That was where they went wrong. And sure enough, beyond Ruby Ridge, beyond Mount Carmel pertaining to Waco, beyond the one of the worst homegrown incidences that ever occurred on this United States soil in 1995 pertaining to the Oklahoma bombing, everything beyond that point has excelled and exceeded backwards. Not better, but has gotten worse. You know, back whenever I was growing up, they didn't talk about open sexual intercourse the way that they do now, towards if you have an erection longer than 4 hours, maybe you should contact your physician. Or talk about some of the other things that they talk about openly on daytime TV. Just like they're talking about cutting the yard. Or they're talking about getting their hair cut. Or they're talking about going to the movie screen theater. They kept these conversations that I'm talking about low key. They still knowed how to have babies. They still knowed
how to do this and how to do that, but they privatized it. They privatized it to the point that it was at the right place at the right time. It wasn't fully exposed and transparent like it is today. All this aggressive behavior pertaining to abortions, all this aggressive behavior pertaining to drugs, all this aggressive behavior pertaining to guns, has all manufactured itself aggressively, as well as the environmental changes in the past 30 years. Up until then, before Jimmy Swaggart's ministry got mocked at and made fun of the way that the American people done what they done, this country was thriving, it was growing, it was excelling, and things was being done in a proper humanitarian form. It wasn't none of this wild-eyed, paint your hair green and yellow and purple and put on as many tattoos and as many body piercing and show as much skin as you can possibly show. You know, I thought of this thought the other day, and I don't mean nothing negative about it, but probably about 80% of people, the youth, the younger people, if they didn't expose 85 to 95% of their bodies out in the public because they are fit and young, prime looking, they probably wouldn't even be able to get a date if it was just based solely upon to their facial appearance. But that's just it. They're using these provocative tactics to be able to lure in their opponents. And it's a wham bam thank you ma'am society, to where if it don't fit, throw it out. It's just like a throwaway lighter. If it don't fit to your 100% criteria, chunk it out. And whenever it comes to making vows, promises, people actually committing to a marriage, that's almost a thing of the past. It's probably less than 20% of the general population. The rest of them flip-flop and jump around from bedroom to bedroom and entice one another with their provocative sexual behavior. Let's listen to some more of this. It's very interesting, to say the least.
First word of it.
In regard to environmental changes.
We are back here at Georgetown. The second part of my interview with former Vice President Al Gore, who spoke to me about what we need to do to avoid the catastrophic consequences of climate change. You've been very focused in the work that you've done on not letting people sort of succumb to doom and gloom, and you've been very focused on optimism. And I've watched as you've gone through charts about adoption of alternative energy, and it's also the case that global emissions have doubled in the last 30 years. They keep going up. What do you do with that? Like there's a part of critique that says it's all broken, it's all going in the wrong way, we're all deluding ourselves. Something truly disruptive and radical has to happen.
Yeah, well, I believe that. But how do you get from here to there? There's no doubt, first of all, that when the future of humanity is at risk, despair is simply another form of denial. It's also true that anyone offering a Pollyanna-ish version of false hope is also engaging in an exotic form of denial. The truth is this: we have suffered losses, some of which regrettably are unrecoverable. There are more losses yet to come that are now inevitable no matter what we do. That's the truth of our situation. But we still retain the ability, according to virtually every scientist and expert in this field that I know, to avoid the truly catastrophic civilization-ending consequences that would occur were we not to act. So, being honest with ourselves about the damage that has been done has to be accompanied by an absolute character-based determination to say, hell yes, we're going to do our best, and we're going to get started as quickly as we can and do it as well as we can. And I don't know any other way to do it. I also believe that in the famous phrase of Rudy Dornbush, the late economist at MIT, things take longer to happen than you think they will, but then they happen faster than you thought they could. And I'll give you a couple of statistics. Just 5 years ago, 1 year before the Paris Agreement, electricity from solar and wind was the cheapest source in only 1% of the world. Today, 5 years later, it's the cheapest source of electricity in 2/3 of the world. In another 5 years, that will be true virtually everywhere. In another 10 years, it is projected to be cheaper than electricity from existing, fully depreciated fossil fuel plants, some of which are already being shut down with useful life remaining because it's just cheaper to get the electricity from the sun and the wind, coupled with battery storage, which is also coming down in price. Now, it's definitely true that the optimism about that is based on new installations, but it's now beginning to shift over to the closing of existing fossil fuel plants. You can look at transportation, same story with electric vehicles. 16 countries have enacted policies requiring the legal phase out, making it illegal after a certain date to sell gasoline or diesel engines, requiring electric vehicles. Within 5 years, half the buses in the world are going to be electric. Now, is it happening fast enough? No. And this is not to speak to manufacturing and regenerative agriculture and sustainable forestry and all the things that have to be done. And yes, it's an externality that has to be priced, but also we have a whole system for measuring what's valuable to us that doesn't just exclude the polluting consequences of carbon dioxide, but excludes the value of everything that's not easily monetized and financialized. And we have to change that system as well.
Final question for you. Is there someone in the Democratic field that you feel best gets this problem, centers this problem, that you're the most confident? I'm not asking for an endorsement.
Oh, it sounded like that.
I'm asking.
But you're just asking me to pick one and avoid the word endorsement if I wish.
I'm asking, look, I think if you take the problem seriously, and as seriously as certainly you do, and I think increasingly younger people do, that the next president of the United States, if it's not this one, is basically going to have to wake up every morning with this the first thing they think about. There's just no way around that. Is there someone in the field, or are there multiple people in the field that you feel confident that that's the case about?
Well, forgive me for really and truly avoiding singling out one candidate. I'm trying to not do that for a lot of reasons. But I'll tell you this: I am really impressed that virtually all of the candidates in this field have made the climate crisis a top priority, some of them the top priority. So many of them have presented elaborate plans in sufficient detail that it would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. And I think that it's reshaping the political dialogue between the two parties. We talked about polling earlier. 67%, more than 2/3 of millennial Republican registered voters say, hey, this party has got to change on climate. Multiple chapters of the College Young Republicans have petitioned the RNC to change its climate policy and warned it that they're going to lose young voters if they do not. We're seeing a real sea change here. And the aphorism from Rudy Dornbush that I mentioned earlier is now playing out in the political world as well. It took a long time without much change, but now I think things are changing. A kind of a dam is breaking, and people are changing swiftly.
Vice President Gore, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Always. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Once more, it's back to what I said on one of my other videos, that according to the good book, the book of life, there's a season for planting, there's a season for harvest. There's a season for war, there's a season for peace. There's a season for deep thinkers, and there's a season for people that's just been putting it on cruise control. I'm kind of like Mr. Gore. I done my best during the 30 years that I was out there in the eyes of the general public towards trying to get my message out before the people pertaining to not only the existence of one being lost pertaining to their spiritual soul, leading them to the Lord Jesus Christ, but also trying to awaken, enlighten people of biblical Bible prophecy of end time events. I tried so desperately and deeply to go from church building to community to state, and got absolutely no results, no supporters, no congregation. Was it enthralling? Absolutely. Especially every time I stood up, I got knocked down. Every time I stood up, I got knocked down. Every time I stood up, I got knocked down. The first time I got knocked down was in 1989, whenever I started on a radio station in WENK, right up here in Union City. And within the third or the fourth session, I had a body shop owner by the name of Mr. Jimmy Atkins, that his uncle was Mr. Wooten, that owned Wooten Chevrolet Garage in Dresden, that basically gave me an ultimatum that said, tell him, which is me speaking, if he does not get off of that radio station preaching his message that he's preaching, that he can seek employment elsewhere. That was basically the first lick towards the ministry, violating my belief, violating my right of First Amendment right towards speaking. And of course, to compound it, was whenever my son and I went to New York City, and I wound up going to Washington, D.C. on 3 different occasions the same year. And that following fall, just about this time of the year, was whenever Homeland Security got in behind Madison County and Jackson, Tennessee, and illustrated their power towards confiscating the very tool or the very instrument from the ministry, which was a tangible sword locked in a case box that took the police officer, 2 of them, about 30 minutes to ever get it out of the box. It had never been taken out of the box since it left the altar. Once more, long about the late 1980s, I think it was in 87 or 88, was whenever Jimmy Swaggart's ministry fell. It was in 1988
whenever 9 tapes went to the White House. It was in 1989 whenever I started my pursuit in this quest that I have now been on for 30 years. Since the events have unfolded, since 1989, from Mount Carmel to Oklahoma City to 9/11 to almost $23 trillion in debt and 2.3 million incarcerated prisoners now in jail. It is escalating, but it is escalating in the wrong way. Instead of us going towards peace, we've actually embraced civil war right here in our own backyard. Between drugs, guns, violence, cop killings, all the other events that has occurred just within the past 10, 11, 12 years, it has almost turned into a war zone right here in the U.S. So my endeavors have been similar to his endeavors. Sometimes things start out slow and gradually quicken up, and sometimes things just gradually continue on. I just know this, according to the scriptures that I can validate, in Acts 23:9, speaks about that if what a person is doing, if it truly be of God, that man cannot overthrow it, and eventually God will make a way for this ministry to grow. I may be in my 70s, I may be in my 80s, I may be in my 90s. But eventually, God will bring a group of people together, a congregation, a support team. And all these empty shells and all these people that was against worldwide peace and against global warming, they will eventually die out. That resistance movement will eventually die out. Kind of like the resistance movement pertaining to being prejudiced against black people. I can see now the younger generation, the millennials growing up, that eventually people that are racist pertaining to being the white people being against the black, or the white people being against the Mexican people, or the white people being against the Arabic people, eventually that is going to phase out. And the reason why is because that resistance that was well known over here in America of being that part of movement during the civil rights movement in the late 50s and throughout the early 60s, those corrupt, evil, demonic, empty shells, those people that was like that, are steadily dying out by the thousands. By the hundreds of thousands, they're dying out. So as they're dying out, so is that resistance. So is that movement. Which is good. Because that type of evil, demonic, sorcery type thinking never should have been in existence to begin with, pertaining to the Homo sapiens here upon to the planet. Just like I believe that there will be a resistance group towards not embracing climate change, environmental changes, that as this resistance dies out, there will be a group of people that will take that void. They will fulfill that same void, and instead of them being hard-headed and saying that climate change or climate crisis don't exist, they'll be more apt, like Al Gore said, It's kind of like the dam opening up all at once, and all of a sudden we got a brand new group of people, a new crop per se, that is growed up, and they're not going to be hard-headed like the greedy, selfish, empty shells was before them, because their eyes is opened and they can see what type of environmental changes is happening all over the world. And if they're going to survive not only as a nation, but survive as a planet, we're going to have to awaken in our way of thinking. And as the resistors die out, the new thinking will come about. And I hope that the new thinking towards supporters in a wide world movement of peace will also die out. Like I said, it's now reached a contradictory exchange with the things going on in the Middle East right now, to the point that it looks like inevitably there's going to be some sort of major clash over in the Middle East pertaining to war. And there may be a gap between where I'm sitting right now in the year 2019 versus 2039. Another 20 years from now, which will put me at 78 years old. There may be a gap, a 20-year gap, before we ever see that resistance die out to the point that there is a congregation or a support team that wants to embrace the windmill ministries in its ideals, in its thoughts pertaining to seeing biblical Bible prophecy fulfill itself. I don't know. I'm just like everybody else. I'm human. I'm not Superman. I'm not the Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was basically half man and half divine, or he was all divine and all man, whichever way that you want to look at it. He was supernaturally I'm going to use a word, and I don't even know for sure if it's the right word, inseminated. He was supernaturally birthed into a virgin's canal of manufacturing the only begotten on the planet. There is not two Jesuses, and there never will be two Jesuses. He is and always will be the Christ, the chosen one, the begotten. It's sad that it takes remarkable, horrible things to happen to society before society finally awakens. Like I said, everything started falling in the wrong direction long about 30 years ago. And now those that are in their 70s, some even in their 80s, some like me that's in their 50s, can look back and see the patterns of the direction that the United States has went in since the movement of the Civil Rights Movement back in the 60s. And I think there'll be a remnant that will come out of all this that will say, you know what? He was right and we was wrong. Just like Mr. Gore. There's people today, they would probably take it to their graves, but there's people today that will say, this man right here was right 30 years ago, whenever the state of Tennessee wouldn't hold him up because they accused him of being an owl lover, a tree hugger,
an environmentalist. There's people today, his age and older, and possibly younger, that went through that time period, that era, that I bet you, if you was to set them into a corner privately and ask them, do you feel like now that this man was right versus the general public that was wrong? And I would go as far as to say that there would be over half of them in his age category as well as mine, if they was honest with themselves, would say, yes, this man was right about his findings pertaining to environmental changes and the climate being in a crisis. He identified it 30 years ago. In other words, he was ahead of his time. Mr. Gore was, that lives up in Nashville, Tennessee. He was ahead of his time. And this is what it takes for a generation to exist. And we must stop ignoring people like this that doesn't just have good ideals, but has proof of findings in regard to their ideals. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, I believe the moon is made out of cheese. Okay? That's kind of like back years ago, they used to think that the world was flat. Well, we know now that the moon is not made out of cheese. Okay? So we move on, we elevate, we evolve, we go on to the next level of our growth if we're going to survive as survivalists here upon this planet. Thanks again to my viewers. Tomorrow does kick off the Hail Mary, I'm going to call it, to the environmentalist and the climate in crisis. I hope and pray that people will be awakened and that they will understand that Mother Earth can only bear so much. The rivers, the streams, our oceans, our air can only bear so much. I kind of look a lot of times at the agriculture. I know according to the Old Testament, whenever they was tilling the grounds, they had a certain time period to where they done a set aside on ground and they gave it a rest. I think it was like once every 7 years or something like that. Today, the way the agriculture farming communities are, they don't give the ground no rest. They throw fertilizer on top of fertilizer, artificial this, artificial that, and they keep growing and growing and growing and growing and growing and growing and growing. And all it's doing is wearing the nutrients and the ground thin. We Homo sapiens are doing this to Mother Earth. And Mother Earth is showing her resistance back because Mother Earth was not built to withstand this type of punishment. And that's exactly what it is. Whenever you have all these carbon dioxide cars and all these moving parts and throwing all this pollution into our oceans and into our seas, we're only cutting our noses off to despite our very own faces. Thank you for letting me be a part of this segment, and good luck to all of us. Shalom.